Hi guys, Zach here. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/cinematary. This gives you access to over 180,000 titles for your iPhone, Android, and Kindle, as well as an MP3 player. Right now, I'm reading Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick, Arthur C. Clarke, and The Making of a Masterpiece by Michael Benson, but Audible users can also access other film books such as Hank and Jim, The 50-Year Friendship of Henry Fonda and James Stewart by Scott Iman, or Five Came Back by Mark Harris. Again, the link to get your 30-day free trial is www.audibletrial.com/cinematary. One more time, www.audibletrial.com/cinematary. Now, on to the show. Welcome to episode 195 of Cinematary. I'm your host, Zach Dennis, and I'm here with
Lydia Creech
and Jessica Carr.
And in today's episode, we will be talking about movies we saw this week in part 1, and in part 2, we will be joined by Aaron Gerow to talk about 1926's A Page of Madness. It's a good chat. He's coming to us all the way from Japan. But let's go ahead and jump into movies that we saw this week. I'm going to kick us off with two that I saw. These are two 2017 releases. I'm playing catch up on last year. I wanted to make a full and comprehensive list 5 months into the year. The first one is Faces Places, the documentary that was written and directed by J.R. and Agnes Varda. I'll preface that I have not seen any of Agnes Varda's stuff prior to this. We're going to be watching Cleo from 5 to 7 later in the series, but this is, I guess, technically the first Agnes Varda film that I've seen, and I think it's supposed to be like her last film. I don't know. I'm not sure. I just saw that somewhere, but essentially this documentary is about Varda, who is a film director, directed numerous amounts of movies, and then you have JR, who is this photographer and muralist in France, and they're journeying around the rural country and becoming best friends. Yeah, that sounds very simple, but that's essentially what this movie is, and it's a very sweet movie. I don't like the term when people refer to something as pure, like, oh, it's just so pure. I feel like that's...
I feel like you're calling Jordan out.
Yeah, I apologize, Jordan, but I just think it's a stupid term. But I'll say that this is like a pure movie. Like, this is so pure. It's just so sweet. It's so innocent. There's this positive energy that kind of permeates from this movie. For the most part, all they're doing is driving around in this car that's super cool. It's JR's car that people can go in like a photo booth and they take their picture, and then this giant print of it like prints out of the car. And so for the most part, they're just driving around rural France and taking people's pictures and pasting them on the wall. From what I gather, for the most part, JR is known for taking photos of things and making giant versions of them, and then painting them or pasting them onto places. Agnes Varda mentions his famous work where he pasted these eyeballs onto these I forgot what they're called, the farming things that hold wheat, silos. I was drawing a blank there. But so for the most part, that's pretty much what they're doing. They're visiting different places and interacting with the people and taking their photo and pasting them onto buildings. For instance, there's at the beginning of the movie, they visit this lady who is the last person to be living in this line of homes that were occupied by miners, because coal mining has just kind of left the town, and people aren't living in these homes. They're all they're all dilapidated and mostly unlivable, except for this one lady's house that she lives in. And it's funny, she talks about how they want to tear down these homes, but she's not leaving the house until she dies, because she's lived there her whole life, and so she doesn't want to leave there. And it's really sweet because Agnes Varda and JR talk to her about her dad. She reminisces on her dad going to work in the mine, and they end up taking people's pictures and pasting the photos of people onto these various houses, and they end by taking a picture of the woman and putting her image on her house, and she has this very emotional reaction to it. Because the thing I was thinking about while watching this movie is kind of our relationship to art, and what art is, one, supposed to do, or two, what people kind of want it to do. And I think that we kind of want it to have this, I guess, emotional resonance with us. We want art to make us feel something, and it's funny because in the second part of this podcast, we talk about avant-garde, films and all of that. And the art that JR and Agnes Varda are doing in this seems very, I guess, I don't know if simple's the right word. It's non-complex, because all it is them taking these pictures of people, or taking pictures of their families, or something like that, and blowing it up and pasting it onto a building to make it stand out more than, I guess, just being this small memento of a person. And there was something really moving about the way people reacted, and the way the community would kind of come together to interact with this art. I think that it's kind of the absolute version of what you would want art to be like, where it becomes this community connector. And I don't know, that seems to be what it was driving and what was so moving about this film. I would recommend it. It is on Netflix now. It's only about an hour and a half long, but it's a very sweet movie, and it's fun to watch this 88-year-old woman and this 33-year-old man interacting with each other, giving each other shit, and
being besties.
Yeah, being best friends. They're really cute together. There's this scene at the very end where Agnes Varda and JR are going to go see Jean-Luc Godard, and he they say that he kind of stands them up. He isn't where they're supposed to be meeting him, and Agnes Varda gets very emotional. You can tell that she reveres Godard, but at the same time she knows that he's a very frustrating person, and she gets frustrated at him. And the way that JR handles it in the movie kind of ends is sure predictable, but also very, very sweet and very complete. You feel very complete from the journey that you've started at, and where these two people have come at the end of it. It's a very nice movie. I would recommend it if you are, if you're a fan of Varda's, but also if you are just kind of, I don't know, you need a little bit of a boost throughout the week. It's a very positive movie. But Faces Places, it is on Netflix. The other movie I want to talk about won the Oscar last year for Best Foreign Film. Comes from Chile, and it is A Fantastic Woman. And it's directed by and written by Sebastian Lelio, and it's well known for its lead performance by Daniela Vega, who is a trans woman, and she plays a trans woman in this film, Marina, who is working as a waitress and also, is a nightclub singer. And at the beginning of the film, you actually are following her boyfriend, who is very old, very much older than she is. Somebody makes a comment that he could have been her father, and she's kind of just like, okay. But you're seeing the boyfriend and kind of him going about his day, and then you come into contact with Marina, and you see them going out on a date and interacting with each other, and there is this warmth and comfort between them that's very affecting very quickly. And so they're spending this evening together, and then her boyfriend wakes up in the middle of the night and is feeling off, and so she is gonna drive him to the hospital, and at one point he falls down these stairs and kind of hurts himself, and then she drives him to the hospital, and he but it's too late. He suffered an aneurysm and passes away. And so for the rest of the movie, it's kind of her coming to terms with this very tragic thing that happened to her, but also it shows the difficulties of her being this quote other woman, not only in terms of how society kind of sees her, but also in terms of how his family sees her. She has just recently moved in with him, and so there's like this awkward tension between her and his ex-wife and his son in terms of like, where's she going to live at this point? What's she going to do with this stuff that she has at his apartment? And you can tell that they're kind of masking their prejudice against her under the veil of, well, we're dealing with this tragic thing. You've only been dating him for a while. Like, this is my ex-husband, this is my father. Like, we're dealing with this awful tragedy. We don't necessarily have time to be decent to you 24/7. But really, as it becomes much more apparent as the narrative rolls along, they just are against the lifestyle that they felt like their ex-husband and their father was living by being in a relationship with Marina. And I can see why so many people were really moved by Daniela Vega's performance. It's such a I don't know. I feel like it's such a strong performance. Seems kind of seems like saying really nothing at all, but it's this. She never really feels like she's knocked down, and I feel like this is kind of one of those examples of why representation in film matters, because having a transgender actress playing this role, I feel like adds a lot more clarity to the situation that this character is dealing with. She doesn't deal with it with like this large degree of melodrama. She kind of understands that you can tell that there is a lot of history within the ways that these characters are treating her, and she's hurt. She's clearly hurt by it, but at the same time, she's recognizing that this is just something that she's been having to deal with for some time now, and it's just another example of terrible people acting terribly. But I don't know. I think that this is it's a strange film. It kind of straddles a lot of different tones. At times it's very kind of bleak and very sad. At other times it's kind of absurd and funny. And at other times it goes a little surreal. I really recommend if you're able to see this. I think it's going to be on streaming and other platforms pretty soon. But A Fantastic Woman, I think it's a fantastic movie. Yeah. Jessica, you had a film that you watched this week that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, so I feel like, Zach, you just talked about a bunch of really warm and sentimental movies, and I'm going to talk about a bloody gore fest of a movie, which is Sion Sono's 2015 film called Tag. It recently came on Netflix, so that's how I got to see it finally, because I know Sono makes films constantly, and we never really get an American release, so it was nice to finally catch it. And I mean, Sono makes really weird films. They're always really off the wall, so you kind of know what you're getting into when you watch them. I had to mentally prepare myself last night before I started watching it. And I was like, okay, I'm probably going to see some arms ripped off and there's going to be blood, but it's going to be fine. So I can read the synopsis, but we all know that it really doesn't matter because it's a Sono film. But it's about a female high school student who becomes the target of ghosts with various appearances, including a groom with a pig's head and a female teacher with a machine gun. So that synopsis doesn't really do the story justice because it ends up being something completely different. And even though this is a 2015 film, I'm not going to spoil the twist that ends up happening towards the end of the film, because I think that if you go into it not knowing it, it actually makes it a more fulfilling experience. But I think that Sono is really smart because he always frames his film by setting the tone that you know that it's going to be a surreal experience for you. The beginning of the movie starts with a gust of wind that ends up slicing a school bus full of high school girls in half, and bodies are just like flying everywhere and blood is spewing everywhere, but one of them kneels to get her pen so she's spared. And, you know, as she's going through this, you're kind of like, did this actually happen to her? And she catches up with some of her other schoolmates, and they're like, no, you know, we don't know what you're talking about. You must have had a weird dream. And so the film kind of goes along that way where weird things are happening and you don't really know if it's real or not. And then it's pretty much explained towards the end of it. And there, even one of the schoolgirls, her name is actually Surreal. So you know going into it that, okay, like the things that are happening aren't really real. And it is actually great because it gives Sono creative liberties to kind of do whatever he wants in this world. So you have a groom that has a pig's head. You have women that are just snapping off the arms of other women in a scenario. But to me, like, the movie, in that instance, like, that would be weird if it didn't mean anything. But he kind of builds, you know, his metaphor for what this movie is really about. And to me, my reading of it is that it is about female anxiety. So are you fulfilling your role as a woman? Are you fulfilling society's expectations for you? And they have several scenes. There's a wedding, so it's like anxiety surrounding getting married, being committed to someone for the rest of your life. There's anxiety for being a high school girl, for losing your virginity, for, you know, dealing with your sexuality. So the twist at the end kind of, it reassures my reading of the film because it all kind of comes together and you're like, okay, you know, this is what the film was really about. The camera work in it is actually really interesting because he uses a lot of drone shots. I didn't really notice in Why Don't You Play in Hell or in Tokyo Tribe if he did that a lot, but in this movie, he uses it a lot to transition. So that was really interesting. And the other thing that was interesting about it is that on Letterboxd, I read a lot of reviews, and to me, this movie is spelled out as a pro-feminist film. The film is almost exclusively a female cast, and the end of it shows a couple of male actors, but they are completely trash characters. So I thought it was weird because there were men on Letterboxd who completely missed that reading of this film. They were like, it's about God, it's about humanity. And I was like, no, it's a very specific message about women and how they're treated in society. So I think it's really interesting that there were so many reads on this film when I felt like there was one specific message that he was trying to point out.
How does it, you mentioned that someone was like a super, super prolific filmmaker and also pretty bloody. How does it compare to like a Miike film who's also, you know, similarly makes like a film a year and they're always like super violent, super bloody?
Yeah, so I think Miike is more of a traditional kind of horror director. I think Sono, his effects when it comes to gore, I think it's more unrealistic. Like you have someone who's just completely ripping off somebody's arm, or you have someone who's just like blasting a machine gun and just like ripping somebody to shreds. But like Miike would use like a wire to cut limbs off, which is it's more realistic. Like that could actually happen. And just the effects of a Miike film lends itself more to just a realistic tone in general. So that's a really good question. I think Miike films overall freak me out more. Like Audition, definitely more scary in terms of gore than a Sono film is.
All right. And that's available on Netflix?
Yes. You should go watch it on Netflix if you liked Why Don't You Play in Hell and Tokyo Tribe. And also if you just want to see like high school girls be badass, because that's also in it.
All right. Lydia, you got a movie, and I kind of want you to talk about it because it's been on our Young Critics ballot for the last 2 years, and people seem to be ignoring it. So maybe a little pitch for next year.
Yeah, I keep putting it on there. I finally caught The Public Enemy. It's a pre-code film, stars James Cagney, stars a baby James Cagney. He's pretty young in this film. It's directed by William Wellman. It's a gangster film, and the reason I keep putting it on the list is because to me it seems like the proto gangster film, and it's really just worth watching for, I don't know, the way Cagney like twitches his faces, or he does this thing where he like fake punches like a affectionate punch, like on the chin of his friends or of his mom, and you can tell his mom fucking hates it when he does that. She's not amused. But I really enjoyed it, and it's also, I'm interested in it also because it's like a pre-code film, and so it's actually pretty violent. But it still has like the downer ending, which I associate with code gangster movies, you know? Like, he has to get his comeuppance. So it still has that kind of like tragic arch. And the last shot's like really shocking, actually. And it gets really surreal. I don't know, spoil it in case we do finally get to talk about it.
Well, I guess after watching it, what, like I said, what would be the reasoning why you would encourage people to maybe consider it for next year?
I think I'd encourage people to consider it just so people are watching more gangster films. And I know it's been remade, I guess, with like Johnny Depp. And so the gangster story is like a very American story. I mean, you have the Westerns, but also I think the counterpart to that is the gangster film. And this is just like a really good example of that.
I feel like definitely it's a type of story that we I think most closely associate. We just assume that a gangster movie means something by like Martin Scorsese or The Godfather by Francis Ford Coppola. So I think it'd probably be interesting to dig back a little farther and learn more about the evolution of the genre prior to those movies.
And like you see the tropes and the like, yeah, sort of familiar narrative arcs, but that's worth looking at in my opinion.
All right. Well, we are going to take a short break. We will be back talking A Page of Madness after this.
Hi there, Cinematary listeners. This is your favorite Filipino podcaster, Jessica Carr, with an important message during this break in the show. Cinematary would like you to know that we surprisingly do not want your money, and we don't want to place ads in the show at this time. That's not why we do this. We do it because we enjoy each other's company, and we want to bring you our pure, unadulterated opinions on the world of cinema. However, there are a few things you can do to help out the show that we would greatly appreciate. Firstly, leave us a review on iTunes, preferably a positive one, because apparently this will help increase our podcast exposure. Secondly, send us a tweet at Cinematary, or better yet, send us an email at cinematary@yahoo.com so we can hear from you guys for a change. Maybe you can tell us where the money from Fargo is stashed, or maybe you don't think In the Mood for Love is the sexiest movie you've ever seen. Regardless, let us know your thoughts and we will read them out and respond to them on future episodes. Finally, please share the show with friends and members of your family who you think really enjoy listening to us and participating in our film discussions. We also have some cool merchandise that you can check out on the site. So to recap, review, send us your thoughts through Twitter and email, and share with your friends and family. We would truly appreciate it. Thank you for listening, and now back to the show.
And we are back with part 2 of episode 195 of Cinematary. And in this part, we will be continuing our Young Critics Watch Old Movies series with 1926's A Page of Madness. And joining us from across the, I don't know if it's across the pond, it's like another pond, but from all the way in Japan is Aaron Gerow. Aaron, thank you so much for taking the time. I know it's morning for you while it's night for us, but thank you so much for coming on the podcast to talk with us.
You're welcome. And just to get it straight, the name is Gerow, if you don't mind.
Gerow.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. It wouldn't be a podcast episode if I didn't mispronounce somebody's name. But yeah, let's go ahead and dig into the movie. If you wouldn't mind, would you just kind of give the listeners a brief synopsis of A Page of Madness and kind of a little background on its history?
Okay. So A Page of Madness is a silent film from 1926. It was made in Japan. It was directed by a director named Kinugasa Teinosuke, and I should probably say that I'm going to be using the Japanese name order, so the name Kinugasa is his family name. It is a film that was strongly influenced by modernism, especially modernism in literature at the time. So the film itself can have a seemingly very simple story. It's about an old man who had a rather rambunctious life, and his wife ended up in a mental hospital, and him feeling guilty about it ends up a custodian at the mental hospital. But he finds out that his daughter is going to get married, but his daughter is worried about whether or not her fiance will end the engagement once he finds out that her mother is a mental patient. The film therefore has a kind of simple story, but what has interested people over the years is the film's form, that it is very experimental, if not avant-garde, in its representations first of madness, of using much of the arsenal of cinema at the time in really distorting our sensations and our impressions. For a long time, the film was considered lost, but it was rediscovered in the 1970s. And when people saw it at the time, they were just amazed. No one really knew that some thing like this could have been made in Japan or in Asia at the time. And it continues to be quite celebrated and shown quite a lot. And quite recently, a Blu-ray of the film came out, so it's now more and more available. So it's a film that I had the privilege of writing about, but it's also a film that lots and lots of people ask me about. So the interest in that film continues.
Yeah, well, I guess to kind of start it out, let's stick on you and what caught your attention about this movie. You mentioned that it was kind of found again in the 1970s, but what attracted you to this film? Because it is such a visually arresting movie. There's a lot of stuff happening over the course of this over hour long runtime.
Yeah, so I first saw the film when I was a student and was really amazed by it because there's not many Japanese films from the 1920s that people can readily see abroad. So that was a really new and amazing experience for me. I originally wrote the book because someone asked me to write it. So it wasn't as if I proposed it at first. But once I started writing it, I really found that the film, in some ways, was representative of lots of the interesting things that were going on in cinema at the time in Japan. But there are also, I think, problems that are pertinent for world cinema, in some ways also for cinema today. So it's, to me, a film that is not only fascinating to watch, but it's also one that really poses some really great questions about cinema, and therefore keeps us thinking about what we're watching.
Yeah, that's something that really caught my attention while reading over your writing on it. It seemed like the one way people wanted to categorize the film was just refer to it as, it's an avant-garde film. And it seems like you kind of push back on that assessment of the movie initially. I guess to you, what does it mean for a movie to be avant-garde? And do you feel like that A Page of Madness fits into that model? Yeah,
so that's one of the things I was kind of confronting when I wrote the book, because there were certain kind of myths that were kind of circulating around that film. The way it was kind of narrated when it was presented abroad was that, it came out of nowhere, that the people in Japan at the time knew nothing of, for instance, the European avant-garde cinema, and they just suddenly produced this out of nothing. Now, it turns out that's not true, and that people in Japan at the time, and including, the director, Kinugasa, were very aware of European art cinema and many of the trends at the time. So in some ways, it doesn't come out of nowhere, and therefore it's engaging with certain kinds of experimental or avant-garde. There are other terms here, for instance, absolute film or pure film. And is engaging with those things. But whether this film is avant-garde or experimental or not is something that's in some ways hard to judge, because the film we see right now is not the film that actually was shown at the time. And that's unfortunately a serious issue. We know from censorship records, because they took very detailed records of films at the time, that the film is much shorter now than it was at the time. And if you project the film at 18 frames per second, it's about 25 minutes shorter. So what was cut from the film is one of the big questions. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of records, but it seems from what we have that the film no longer has quite a number of scenes which you could consider the most melodramatic scenes in the film. That, especially the scenes revolving around the daughter and her fiance, have mostly disappeared from the film. And if you look at the people writing about the film at the time, they were actually debating those scenes. some people loved the scenes of the curator progressively kind of descending into madness, but they didn't like the melodramatic scenes. So it's tempting right now to look at the film and see it as very experimental and very avant-garde. But we also have to remember that at the time, there were probably a lot more scenes that were kind of normal, that were less experimental or less avant-garde. But to me, that's actually one of the more interesting things about the film, that it actually stood on the boundary between a kind of regular narrative film and a avant-garde or experimental film at the time. And therefore, it really caused people to think about, well, what should cinema be?
Yeah, that's kind of the question that I was thinking about while reading through was, I feel like when people refer to a film as avant-garde, it's almost like a qualifier to say that they didn't understand what they just watched. It's not necessarily that the film fits the definition of what avant-garde would be. It's more, this film didn't necessarily translate well over to me, and so this is the way I can use to describe it without seeming too ignorant. And so I like that you kind of explored that definition and kind of poked at what people assume this means and why this film doesn't necessarily fit that definition.
I don't know. What's interesting to me is like it's still very early days of cinema, just globally also. And I really liked in your piece where you'd mentioned that actually they were being influenced by French theories of film and like other foreign filmmakers. And it's just not like this emerged out of a bubble. And it's like, oh, they do and film their own way without any reference to anything else. That's it. So the evolution was really good.
Unfortunately, you have seen a lot of film history being written, which just assumes that cinema begins in the West, in Europe and America, and that other countries might produce great cinema, but they are kind of behind the West. And in Japan as well, people really adopted that kind of perspective for a long time as well. And that's one of the interesting things about the reception of Page of Madness at the time, that people, some critics thought that finally we Japanese, after essentially 30 years of cinema in Japan, because cinema first appears in about 1896 in Japan, after 30 years, we finally made our first film. That's, in a sense, what people were saying about Page of Madness at the time. But getting back to the issue of avant-garde, I mean, I think, Zach, your, in some ways, simple definition of avant-garde is actually a proper definition, in that one of the ways of defining an avant-garde film is precisely with regard to narrative and the ability to understand that an avant-garde film or an experimental film can be defined precisely by its difference or its opposition to the dominant form of cinema making in the world, which is narrative cinema, and especially that put forward by the Hollywood studio system. And that's really what a lot of people were focusing on at the time with Page of Madness. Some people who thought the film was not experimental enough were saying cinema, to be pure cinema, has to get rid of narrative. It has to be even more difficult to understand. In fact, it has to undermine understanding itself. That cinema ideally should be the rhythm of light. Who cares even about real figuration or stories and characters? Ideally, cinema should just be light and shadow on the screen. So that's one of the ways the film really sparked a lot of conversations about what cinema is.
I mean, I guess, and when this movie came out, did Japanese audiences respond to it positively? Like, did they find this to be, in terms of movies, a good movie?
That's a good question. And unfortunately, we've got obviously a lot of reviews and discussions in the film magazines and newspapers at the time. So we know that one sector of the audience, which of course would be in some ways more intellectual or the the real big film fans, that they were very interested in the film. I mean, some of them criticized it, but it was sparking a lot of interest. We don't know much about what you could call average spectators and what they thought about the film. The film itself did not show that much. It opened, at least commercially, in September 1926, and it showed in a number of theaters around the country, but it did not show all around the country. There were quite a number of places in Japan it did not show. And at least according to Kinugasa's own records, he lost a lot of money on the film. He made the film independently. So it was not a box office success, in other words. So you could argue from that, well, maybe people didn't like it or they didn't understand it a lot. So there is a big question about really if it was in some ways ahead of its time or if people had a hard time keeping up with it. But one of the interesting kind of episodes that has been recorded is one of the places it showed was the Musashino-kan, which was like the high-class movie theater in Tokyo at the time. And this film, as with other silent films in Japan at the time, was narrated by a figure we call the benshi. One of the interesting aspects of Japanese silent cinema culture, that when silent films were shown in Japan, there was somebody who stood next to the screen and who narrated the film, who explained, who kind of dubbed the dialogue, you could say. But the benshi at the Musashino-kan was Tokugawa Musei, who was really probably one of the most famous benshi. Later went on to be a great actor as well. And someone writing about the film commented that the spectators around him after the film ended at the Musashino-kan stood up and said, "Wow, Tokugawa Musei really made me understand that film that I could not understand." And so, sometimes it could depend, therefore, on, what the benshi was able to do with that film. So there's a lot of factors about the film that we just don't know. Did the benshi, how did the musicians deal with this pretty strange film?
Was the benshi, did they not have standardized scripts, or it was kind of up to them to help interpret it?
That's a good question. And in general, the benshi did not have full scripts. It's not as if the movie studio or the filmmakers would prepare an entire script, which the benshi would then read word for word.
Right.
Especially in the early days, the benshi basically had nothing. They watched the film the day before it was to be screened at the theater, and they had to come up with something. And so there are lots of complaints in the early years of benshi who were getting everything wrong, especially with foreign films.
That's good.
But the studios did try to standardize this a bit by at least providing detailed summaries. Mm-hmm. Also, there's the issue of censorship, because censorship was pretty strict in Japan at the time. And you could probably imagine that censors would have a problem if, at the censorship bureau, they would watch the film and they say, "Oh, okay, well, this scene is not good. We don't like the dialogue here. We'll cut that." And then they send it off to the theater, and then the benshi, using his or her words, ends up saying something which is very, very problematic. So the benshi in some ways also had to be controlled or censored. So the censorship officials did want a rather detailed summary, which they would use to serve as a kind of record of what the film was and therefore what the Banshee should stick to. And we do have actually one of those for Page of Madness, which again serves as one piece of evidence of what might be missing from the film, because these summaries were supposed to be accurate to the film. And in fact, if you change the summary, you had to resubmit it to censorship and get it stamped. So the Banshee could use these as a kind of basis, but there still was a lot of variation from theater to theater and from Banshee to Banshee. Sometimes even the same Banshee, depending on if he was feeling well or not, could be narrating it in a quite different way.
It's almost like this was like their version of Mystery Science Theater 3000 or something. Like it's you know, the interpretation of the movie is all up on this one person.
Yeah, and that's one of the ways that the Banshee has survived in Japan. There are still people who serve as a Banshee, and some of them try to do it historically accurately, but some like to play with it and quite literally, almost like Mystery Science Theater, come up with their own version of the film that's quite different from what the film actually is.
Now, it seemed like the one film specifically that was kind of related to Page of Madness was The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which came out in 1920. It's, you know, people seem to compare it because of the fact that the narrative featured characters in a mental hospital. And so I guess what did you kind of make of that comparison? Do these two films share more than just that narrative kind of through line?
Yeah, I mean, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari did open in Japan. I think it was 1921 or 2, and was quite successful, caused quite a stir. Many people, especially many intellectuals, watched it. And it did prove influential. So, for instance, one other very famous Japanese filmmaker is Mizoguchi Kenji. He's famous for such post-war films as Ugetsu. But when he started making films in the 1920s, he made a film called Blood and Soul, which is considered to be very, very significantly influenced by Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Unfortunately, the film does not exist. We only have photographs of it. So in general, Caligari was quite influential. And at the time, of course, people also talked about Page of Madness in relation to the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, though sometimes in quite interesting ways, trying to argue that Page of Madness is actually a lot more interesting than Caligari. But when you talk about actual influences, I mean, obviously the story being set in a mental institution, the fact that at least some of the set design seems to be kind of expressionistic. Some of the cell blocks in the mental hospital really seem to be quite gloomy to the point of being unrealistic. So there seems to be somewhat expressionistic elements of the film. But at the same time, not just in Japan, but elsewhere as well, you know, Caligari was criticized for being in some ways too painterly, for doing its expression not in film form, but in set design. And if you want to compare Caligari to other experimental or art film movements at the time, one of the comparisons people often do is between German expressionist cinema and French impressionist cinema, especially the films of Abel Gance and Marcel L'Herbier and Germain Dulac in the mid-1920s. And in those films, there's also an effort to experiment, but there the experiment is not in set design, but in film form, and using fast editing, double, triple exposures, fast camera movements. And if you want to say what is Page of Madness most influenced by, it would actually be more the French films than Caligari, because unlike Caligari, it's not devoting a lot of time to set design. It's devoting a lot of time to film form and playing with editing and camera movement and double and triple exposures. And lots of people noted that at the time, that this really seems to be very influenced by French film.
It did remind me of, we watched a few weeks ago, Duloc's The Seashell and The Clergyman, although weirdly enough, this one made more sense.
No, I definitely agree with that because, yeah, like Lydia said, we watched 2 of Jermaine Duloc's films, and I think that the way that the camera kind of tugs around and moves so quickly does feel much more reminiscent of these French impressionistic films rather than the German expressionist films, because I kind of agree with your point that I think that when people probably think of Caligari, they think of the slanting of the sets and how jagged the setting is, and Page of Madness doesn't really have that. It has more. It feels like this ominous spatial relationship. You know, it has these long hallways in these rooms that kind of feel both claustrophobic but also very expansive. It's kind of a weird juxtaposition between the two, the Caligari and Page of Madness.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the ways that people talk about Page of Madness historically is its relationship to modernist literature at the time. In particular, a modernist literary group called the Shinkankaku-ha in Japanese. It's variously translated as the new sensationists, the new impressionists, and some of the members of that group were actually involved in the production of the film. So one of the ways the film is marked is that it was written, or at least part of the script was written by Kawabata Yasunari, who later became the first Japanese to win the Nobel Prize in Literature for such great works as Snow Country, Sound of the Mountain. But in his early years, he was very much a modernist, and the new sensationists were very interested in sensation, in impression, in perception, and they were really interested in how psychology, how perception affects our relationship with the world. And they were experimenting with ways of altering perception, altering sensation in ways that, in some ways, took apart the structures of literature and of narrative. And that's one reason why many people want to talk about the film in relation to that literature movement, because this is a film that quite literally kind of explores the breakup of perception, of how, especially this one individual, his perception of the world kind of falls apart. That's
I definitely feel like you feel that out of the character while watching this film. The next thing I kind of wanted to talk about was the director, Kinogasa. I guess, what can you tell us about him and his, I guess, kind of career in cinema? It seemed like he was very interested in doing different styles of narrative and acting prior to making movies.
Yeah, I mean, Kinogasa Teinosuke has a very interesting career. At least at the time, and I mentioned this in the book, at least film critics, or most film critics, really didn't sorry about that. Most critics at the time really didn't expect much from him. They didn't really like him. He was someone who actually came into film as an actor. And what's quite interesting is that he was actually an onnagata, which means he played female roles on the stage and in film. But most Japanese films in the 1910s and early 1920s were still kind of based on theater. And most theater at the time did not have women on stage. It had men playing female roles. And Kinugasa was one of those actors. He quickly realized that film, as it was kind of modernizing in Japan, was going to get rid of the onnagata and start using actresses. So he switched to directing. But most people didn't really expect much of him, and they were quite surprised with A Page of Madness. But it's not as if he made a lot of experimental films after this, though he did make a couple films later on in the 20s and the 1930s, which kind of continued his effort to kind of explore different forms of cinema. So a couple years after this film, he made a film called Jujiro, or Crossroads, which is very much a kind of art film. It's not as experimental in its use of film form as Page of Madness, in part because it's not necessarily about madness. But it's a great film. It survives, and there are a lot of people who talk about it. And in fact, that was the film that Kinugasa took with him when he went to Europe in, I think, 1929. And in fact, that film was opened in theaters in Europe at the time. So it was one of the first Japanese films to be shown in Europe. And, you know, in the 1930s, he also made some experiments with, for instance, mixing theater and film. He's most famous, other than for Page of Madness, for the film Gate of Hell, made in the 1950s, one of the first color films in Japan. And if I remember correctly, it was one of the first films to win the Oscar for a foreign language film. It's a fantastic film, at least in terms of its use of color. But in general, he was a film director who made jidaigeki, or kind of samurai films, and not necessarily known for his experimental work. That most of his films were rather conventional in terms of narrative, somewhat melodramatic, which might come from his own experience as an actor in melodramatic theater called Shimpa. And so he has a very varied career. And it's kind of hard to talk about him in one sentence. But I think that's what makes him quite interesting, that he just did do so many different things.
When you said that he kind of was trying to merge theater with movies, what's exactly was he kind of trying to do? It seemed like there was a lot of elements of and now correct me if I pronounce this wrong, Shinpa theater and that acting style in Page of Madness, which was something that I had no idea what that was, and so it seemed like it was something that was highly influential on the technique of the actors in this movie.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. Now, in Japan, obviously, most people have heard of kabuki theater. There are, in other words, forms of theater in Japan, kabuki, no, which have existed for centuries, and you could call them in some ways traditional theater. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were efforts in Japan to modernize theater. And one of the first of them was what has now been come to be known as Shimpa. And the term itself actually means, kind of the new theater. And it was originally an effort to kind of modernize theater by bringing in contemporary stories. And it was actually, in its early years, actually had a political side to it. It was kind of almost used as agitprop theater. But by the 1910s, Shimpa itself had already become kind of almost a conservative form of theater, mainly revolving around kind of melodramatic stories. Some of them could be, still kind of political. Many dealt with stories of crossed lovers, of a woman from a poor family falling in love with a rich young man. He gets her pregnant, but his family won't allow her to marry him, and they take the baby and they throw her out, and she suffers and dies. Those kind of melodramatic stories are quite common in Shimpa. So by the 1910s and 1920s, there were new forms of theater, such as shingeki, which is also kind of means new theater, which were trying to act against Shimpa. And many of those working in cinema at the time, where you also had a kind of Shimpa theater version of film, were also trying to work against Shimpa. So in general, if Shimpa is seen to be influential in this film, and it definitely is, I think, in terms of its narrative, the narrative itself is very Shimpa. That kind of melodramatic, is our young heroine going to get married, or this kind of notion of hereditary madness, is that going to stop her from getting married to this nice rich young man? If the film was seen as Shimpa, that was actually a bad thing at the time. That is, that would be something that was not modernist, that was kind of conventional or conservative. But it wasn't just Kinugasa, but the main actor, Inoue Masao, also was a Shimpa actor. So you could see in his acting and some of the acting of some of the others influences of the Shimpa theater as well. But it wasn't necessarily something that especially intellectual film critics at the time would have wanted to see in this film.
So it kind of, I guess, I'm trying to think of this in modern terms. I don't know. Did it seem like this technique was almost kind of to relate it to in Western terms, almost kind of like method acting, where you'd have these actors taking on a different technique rather than what was more traditionally seen in terms of this cultural movement?
That's an interesting problem there. And I mean, one of the ways that theater scholars have tried to talk about theater in Japan is the difference between presentational theater and representational theater. That, especially in the traditional forms of theater like kabuki, the goal is not to kind of hide the theatrical elements, create that fourth wall so that we get a representation of something that's real. It's something that kind of foregrounds the fact that it is theater. So in kabuki, you have very outlandish costumes and makeup. Actors will use the hanamichi to actually enter into the audience. There's no fourth wall. And the shingeki theater, which I just mentioned, is kind of like the representation or the representative of modern realist theater in Japan. One that really tried to create a fourth wall and create acting which is supposed to be representational, realistic. Shimpa ends up being in between these two. That it's aiming for more realism, modern stories, contemporary stories, but the acting can still be quite presentational. In fact, again, many Shimpa theater troupes at the time would still have onagata. They would not have women actors. And so that kind of ends up being a kind of bizarrely mixed form. There's still the question about how much of the acting in Page of Madness is coming from Shimpa and how much of it is coming from even more modern forms like Shingeki. I think it's still open to debate, but in general, I think the weight is towards more modern forms of acting as such as the kind of more representational acting of Shingeki.
Lydia, Jessica, do you all have any questions before we kind of wrap up?
No, I'm good.
I'm interested to know if, Aaron, when you were watching this movie for the first time ever, did you find the narrative to be straightforward?
No, I did not. Yeah. So one of the things I do actually when I show this film in class, I don't do it all the time, but every once in a while, is I don't introduce it. I just show it as is, and then afterwards ask my students, well, how much of it did you get? What did you understand? What do you think the story was? And it's very interesting. I mean, most students will get a lot of what's going on, but especially that story of the daughter and her fiance is kind of hard to understand, especially if you don't have someone explaining the film at the time. So really it is in the way the film is now, a film that's hard to understand. And there is a strategy of watching the film, which is to, read the plot summary beforehand and then watch it. But in some ways, I would recommend just, going at it cold and watching it just for the first time as is. But then afterwards, reading a bit about the film afterwards, figuring out, oh, well, that was kind of like the story. But I think the important question there is not, oh, I understand the story now, that's fine. But rather, oh, well, okay, now I understand the story. Well, why did they upset the story so much? Why did they undermine it? Why didn't they tell it in a way that I could easily understand? I think that's the most important set of questions for the film.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. I'll speak for myself and say that at least I feel like I've got a lot more out of the movie than I feel like I was in that category of I watched it the first time and I was just like, I don't know what to make of this. So I really appreciate you coming on and chatting with us.
No, it really is one of my favorite films. And I was fortunate enough to be able to write a book about it. But I love talking about this film, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you folks about it.
And that will wrap up this episode of Cinematary. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cinematary, on Twitter at handle @Cinematary, and on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/Cinematary, where we post all the movies that we talked about in this episode. Next week, we will be continuing our Young Critics Watch Old Movie series with 1932's Merrily We Go to Hell. Looking forward to it. All right. Thanks again, everybody, for listening. I wanted to take one final moment to remind you to check out Audible and get a free 30-day free trial just for being a listener of Cinematary. You can start your trial by going to www.audibletrial.com/Cinematary and picking through over 180,000 titles that can be accessed from your iPhone, your Android, your Kindle, or even your MP3 player. Again, that link is www.audibletrial.com/Cinematary. See you next week.